And now we are joined by our distinguished speakers. Hello, my name is Jack and I am the host of this virtual forum. Thank you very much for giving us an opportunity to welcome you to the Nation Forum. First off, I would like to ask each of you to explain a bit more about your companies. May I start with Mr. Marcus from Zipmex? What is the mission and vision of your company as well as your latest movement?
Sure, thanks Jack. Really excited to be here with everyone today. So Zipmax is a regional digital asset platform. We're headquartered in Singapore, we're licensed in Thailand, and we're also in Indonesia and Australia. So we provide the ability for our customers to transact in digital assets and cryptocurrencies, and we also provide a platform for them to earn interest. And we're also kind of moving into the payment space and the NFT space.
Great. And Mr. Henry?
Hello, everybody. My name is Henry Chong. I'm the CEO of Fusang. Fusang operates Asia's first digital stock exchange, and we think that our platform and our unique combination of technology, regulatory licenses, and operational know-how lets us provide this end-to-end lifecycle for digital securities. The issuance, tokenization, listing, and trading of them. We hold a number of licenses across Asia, most famously of which is the Fusang Exchange, where we're licensed, as I said, to be the primary listing venue for companies for IPOs and also act as our market regulator. And our team is split across 5 cities today, but really all centered around one single vision, which is to make it as easy for people to invest into companies as it is for those people to buy products from companies online.
Very much, Mr. Henry. And Mr. Nichel.
Hi, so my name is Nichel. I'm founder and CEO of PDAX. PDAX is a local licensed crypto exchange based in the Philippines. So we do a little bit of what Marcus also mentioned. We're a platform for the trading of digital assets against the Philippine peso. And we also do a bit of securities issuance and trading. More recently, a couple of years ago, we launched the national treasury bonds on the Ethereum blockchain, and we're going deeper into the Philippines as opposed to having a more regional presence. So yeah, and more recently, we've also been focused on the growth of the NFT-based games here in the Philippines, and are expanding more use cases around those types of applications.
Thank you very much, Mr. Nichel. Now, I'd like to ask each of you to give us an update about the situation of digital assets in each of your territories. Perhaps can I start with Mr. Henry?
Absolutely. Well, as I said, Fusang operates across a number of jurisdictions. Our stock exchange is based in Labuan in Malaysia, but we have people and officers all over. And to me, that's really what is unique about digital assets, that in many ways, they start to dissolve geographical boundaries. But when it comes to things like security tokens or digital securities, what Fusang really focuses on, I think it's important to remember that even though you have a new technology layer, you still have to comply with rules and regulations in jurisdictions around the world. And in our view, if you have something like a security token, just because it's new tech doesn't mean that you shouldn't be following and complying with existing rules. That said, I think that the security token market as a whole globally is moving at incredible speed. Every other week now you hear about a bank or a country looking to use tokenization technology to represent traditional assets like shares, bonds, funds, etc. And there was a recent thought leadership report put out by a consulting firm, Quinlan & Associates, here in Hong Kong, that estimated that by 2030, a quarter of all publicly listed securities around the world will be tokenized. That's about a $4 trillion issuance volume. And we're very excited to be able to build some of what we consider the foundational infrastructure pieces that we think are necessary to get us from here to there.
Great, thank you very much. And what about you, Mr. Marcus? How about the environment in Singapore when it comes to digital assets?
Sure. So as I mentioned, we are actually regulated in 4 countries. So Singapore being our parent company, and we're regulated under MAS. So as of recent, MAS has been releasing licenses to a lot of the players that have been applied for the last few years. So the Payment Services Act is the governing act for digital assets, and there are many limbs under that. So digital payment token is a limb underneath the Payment Services Act. And so, the MAS have been quite supportive, but as of recent, they've been quite restrictive in terms of what can be advertised to the general public in Singapore, as they're trying to, essentially kind of limit the risk exposure for some of these retail investors. But more broadly, we are also in Thailand, Indonesia, and also in Australia. And Thailand is actually the most kind of advanced in terms of their regulatory framework for cryptocurrencies. They started back in 2018, where the emergency decree came in, and where we saw a lot of the exchanges kind of grandfathered into the new system. We were a new applicant that got licensed back in 2020 and been operating for the last year and a half. The regulators are also taking a very lockstep approach from a regional perspective in terms of things like travel rule, in terms of what can be advertised, and also in terms of what kind of tokens can be listed. So the regulators are trying to catch up with, the changing environment of cryptocurrency, moving from just a pure exchange model where people are just buying and selling crypto to things like, DeFi, CeFi, and then the NFT and the metaverse space. So our job really is to kind of work with the regulators, educate them so that they are well equipped with the right tools to be able to provide the right policy or framing the policy in order for it to be the right, in order for it to be conducive in the ecosystem.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Marcus. And Mr. Nichel.
Yeah, I find it so interesting that the Southeast Asian markets are experiencing their growth spurts in different and interesting ways. In the Philippines, a lot of the growth had come through this emerging play-to-earn trend, where a lot of Filipinos during the pandemic who lost their jobs or lost their main source of income turned to games that allow them to earn tokens, and these tokens, which are listed on a variety of decentralized and centralized exchanges, allowed for them to eventually convert into Philippine peso and live off of those earnings. So the play-to-earn trend in the Philippines led to probably the growth that we're seeing now, where there are about 3 million or 3.5 million MetaMask users in the Philippines. Now, because of that strong crypto-friendly or crypto-savvy base, we're also seeing play-to-earn actually has acted as a gateway use case for all kinds of use cases for cryptocurrency. So that extends to trading, which we've seen already over the past couple of years, but also in remittances and applications in the securities space. So I echo what my co-panelists shared about developing regulatory framework in their respective jurisdictions. Here in the Philippines, the regulators have been very progressive in creating rules around all the use cases surrounding crypto, and that includes digital securities as well. So definitely a lot of exciting things happening, both from a market standpoint and also a regulatory standpoint.
So you've mentioned crypto games, also a lot of trading in cryptocurrencies. NFTs have been on the tip of a lot of investors' tongues, whether you are very well versed in digital assets or just people who are hearing about it and wanting to get involved. Can you also identify other trends or local interests that are starting to emerge within the digital space, perhaps related to investments and payments?
Yeah, so for payments, I think one thing, at least speaking for the Philippines, one thing that has been very strong for us is cross-border remittance. The Philippine peso being a third currency, and almost all of our migrant workers sending money through another third currency just ensures that that process is not going to be cheap, right? So the remittance use case also grew in popularity, probably not as sexy, but definitely in terms of volumes, they're there. In terms of investments, the Philippine equities market, which primarily has been intermediary-based, has actually struggled to expand for obvious reasons, right? The Philippines is an archipelago, and until very recently, there has been no way to conduct meaningful KYC without doing things face-to-face. And so from a practicality standpoint, brokers were really not able to create branches everywhere in the Philippines to service the population. So more recently, we're seeing a lot of corporates and institutions who are now asking themselves whether it probably makes sense for them to raise capital via the token markets. So there's a lot of stuff happening on that front as well.
All right. And Mr. Henry, how about you? Do you have any trends that you think are worth keeping an eye on?
Well, here at Fusang, we're obviously big believers in securities, as I said. I think the world of cryptocurrencies and NFTs is unbelievably exciting. But I think there's also a lot to be said for what I call the other 99% of world assets. The shares, bonds, funds, the real estate that we live in, really everything that we see around us today. I think all of those assets can and will and should be tokenized as well. And I think that's really an inevitability. I cannot imagine that in the years to come, we will continue to have literal pieces of paper that represent all of the assets that we own. I'm convinced that blockchain technology makes a lot of sense and that we're going to see traditional assets come online, be tokenized, listed and traded, very similar to how cryptocurrencies are today. The big difference, of course, is that it becomes very important to be clear when you have a security token, what is the underlying asset? Does the token directly represent, for example, shareholding in a company? What are the rights that I get? What are the actual assets that I am owning? And I think that people can and will start to look at things in a slightly different lens, where they say, what are the fundamental value drivers of securities like that?
Okay. Very interesting. And Mr. Marcus, why do you think that the world needs to pay attention to these digital assets, and that it's not just something that's optional or fringe, but that it is becoming more increasingly mainstream?
So I think the world definitely needs to pay attention, because the people that are adopting digital assets are effectively the millennial generation. And as they say, the genie's out of the bag. So there's no way to kind of, pull this back into the bottle. It is what it is right now, and all regulators have to pay attention because everyone is adopting it. Almost everyone is adopting it. So the key here is, how do policymakers and regulators think about ensuring that they still have a governing system to their monetary policy, right, in terms of their local currency, and how do they deal with, cryptocurrency, which could, in essence, kind of conflict with their monetary policy, as we kind of see, flows of funds going out or going from, the local currency to cryptocurrency. And this is something that, the regulators are trying to grapple with. So that's one. The second one is around the applications of blockchain or not kind of cryptocurrency. As we've seen over the last 6 months, we've moved towards, the NFT market space and then very quickly into the metaverse space. We've seen big companies like Facebook rebranding themselves into Meta, which effectively is focusing into the metaverse space. And so for a lot of the brands, what we've seen over the pandemic is that, we've seen multiple lockdowns and people are not interacting as much in the physical world, and now they're kind of moving into the virtual world. So the question is, how do we, create a virtual world that everyone can coexist, and for the brands to be able to be omnipresent, in that space versus in the physical space. So I think this is a really kind of important, thematic that is, evolving very, very quickly. So the key is, how do businesses and also the government is able to evolve with the changing times.
Interesting. That I was wondering about how the pandemic was affecting the digital assets. We also have a lot of political conflicts, especially as what we see in Eastern Europe and the Ukraine. Can any of you give us your insights in how these events may be affecting these markets?
Sure, I can definitely.
Oh, okay.
So I can kind of definitely add in there. So, I mean, the key piece in the Russia-Ukraine war is obviously the financial sanctions that are being applied by the Western world into Russia. And what we've basically seen is the restriction of the SWIFT network into all Russian banks. So effectively, anyone with a Russian bank account is not able to remit money. The ruble, of course, has basically plummeted against the dollar. And so if we kind of look at Bitcoin, for instance, in a decentralized format, people are able to still transfer value. So for the very first time, what we can see in this kind of modern era, if you want to call it, or at least during the existence of cryptocurrency, is that people are able to kind of still remit value. So whilst the ruble was plummeting, we actually saw a reasonable spike in the price of Bitcoin, because a lot of the Russians and also the Ukrainians were actually buying Bitcoin in order to continue to transfer value or as a hedge against their local currency, i.e. the ruble.
Mr. Henry, do you have any insight on this as well?
Absolutely. I think the world is always volatile, right? Sometimes more than others. But I think that what's happening in the world today is a great reminder that as much as we are trying to construct a new digital ecosystem, this all still needs to be grounded in the way that the rest of the world works. Not just in terms of politics, but also just in terms of, as Marcus was mentioning, how asset flows happen. And I think that for the cryptocurrency markets as a whole to take the leap into what I think of as kind of crypto 2.0, where we can live in this vision of a world in which really all assets are tokenized. Novel cryptocurrencies, NFTs, securities, even traditional fiat currencies through things like CBDCs. We need to understand that all of these asset classes are going to interrelate. And I think we need to start viewing cryptocurrencies in that broader framework and lens. Today, the truth is the world of digital assets and the world of traditional assets is still very split. And I think inevitably these things will start to merge. And as I said, I think we will start to look at tokenization as a technology layer that really influences how all assets everywhere are issued, tokenized, listed, and traded.
And let's say there are retail investors out there who maybe are a bit hesitant about entering the digital asset market. What kind of advice would you give to these potential investors about dipping their toe into this space? Maybe I would start with you, Mr. Nichel.
Well, that's definitely, it's very difficult to give financial advice. As you know, investment and financial decisions are always bespoke to the individual. But for people who are not exposed to crypto right now, I think it's important to acknowledge that if you are not currently in crypto, you are not exactly taking a neutral position here. Neutral in the sense that you're keeping yourself free of risk. Probably the safest way to go is to have a balanced portfolio where you at least have some exposure to crypto. Now, sharing a bit of my personal view on the crypto markets, what we're seeing here is a trend that will lead to a once-in-a-generation wealth transfer. And the later a person is to join this trend or to take part in the crypto markets, the more you're staying at the losing end of the wealth transfer. Now, what we're seeing in crypto is not something that just affects finances, right? It's something that affects ownership and how we transact, even in day-to-day commerce going forward. I think I would wish to echo also what Marcus said earlier about how, in relation to your earlier question about its, I guess, geopolitical implications. Well, on the one hand, crypto could be probably used to circumvent restrictions on SWIFT, ergo, not allow SWIFT to be weaponized or these sanctions to be weaponized. The reverse could also be true, right? Eventually, because of the transparency and the traceability inherent to crypto, perhaps in the future, sanctions could be made more effective, and that may or may not be a good thing. But at least what's proven true is that greater transparency has always served the benefit of the public. So, long story short, what we're seeing is a very fast-moving, massive wave, and we have to take, every individual will probably have to take a position in crypto, whether it's buying something small relative to the portfolio or something very big. Certainly, everyone's probably got to be exposed at this point.
Thank you, Mr. Nichel. Mr. Marcus, how about you? I noticed that there was a big Zipmex roadshow taking place in Bangkok at Siam Paragon and Icon Siam to try to introduce people to the metaverse, to cryptocurrencies, to NFTs, explaining that at a very basic level what these digital assets are. What do you think are other ways that would be potentially advantageous for you to reach out to somebody who may be of a different generation that thinks, well, maybe this is something for me to look into?
Yeah, definitely, Jack. So I think what's really interesting is if we looked at the last couple of years only, is that when you ask me the question of how for someone who hasn't got into cryptocurrency, what advice would you give them? And I think that narrative back then was around investing into cryptocurrency. But the narrative now has ultimately evolved. It's not just about investing into cryptocurrency, but how do you interact with it? Whether it's in art form or whether it's in the metaverse form, right? And I think the applications, as you start to broaden in the spectrum, it's about the various different touch points that people can now see themselves, interacting in this entire ecosystem, because it's no longer about, if I'm going to invest today $1, how much money I'm going to make in 5 or 10 years time. It's about how do I interact it from, like the NFT space? How do I interact it from, the gaming space? Or, if there are a lot of kind of traditional gamers, how do they move in from, the Web 2.0 to Web 3.0, right? And so our job really isn't to force anyone through one pigeonhole, which is to say, come to us, buy crypto first, then go into the other spaces. But rather, our thesis is there is so many applications to digital assets and in this entire ecosystem. We want to educate you in the way that you want to be educated. If you don't like investing, that's perfectly fine, because we understand people's risk tolerance or risk appetite is completely different, and they still are still challenged by this concept of investing into cryptocurrency because it's not, entirely asset-backed, at least for most of them, right? And so for those who are gamers, right, how do they transition from the Web 2.0 to the Web 3.0, right? Content creators, for example, who are, kind of traditional artists or just general content creators, how do they move into the NFT space, right? That does not exist, or that does not require them to actually start investing into it. But content creators for the NFT space, right, is about how they can showcase their talent, not just within the construct of their, within the community or their country, but to the entire world, where we have marketplaces that basically allow you to go global from day one. So I think the key here for us, even though we're, quite rooted in Thailand, for example, and what we've done at Siam Paragon is really is a foretaste, for a lot of, people who are very interested in the space, kind of showing them what are some of the things that can play out over the next couple of years, how they can interact with this space, right? And then slowly to help them build that bridge, right, into the virtual world.
Okay. So it's more not just about a speculation of putting in a bit of money and hoping that you turn a profit in a few months or a year.
Exactly. Yeah, and I think for most people are very much just bulk of the people are very much interested about a financial outcome. And for those people who are just interested about financial outcome, then what we say to them is, you have a short-term goal and then you have a long-term goal. And your long-term goal, if you're looking to invest, then it's buy and hold, right? It's similar to securities as well. And then in terms of the short-term goal, where you want to trade, that's fine, right? So you have a strategy around the short-term and the long-term. And the deployment, like what Nichel mentioned about, it's all about kind of diversification and deployment of your own assets. How much of your entire wealth do you want to allocate into digital assets? The common rhetoric has always been, put 1% or put 5%. Some people are more a bit audacious, they go 10 and 20%, right? Or some people have 100% of their entire wealth. what we are seeing is the trend is that 1% is slowly going up, in a very exponential rate towards 100%. I wouldn't say everyone's at 100%, of course, but more and more people are kind of putting more of their wealth into the digital asset space, especially for the digital natives, which are the millennial generation, the Gen Zs, right? And I think that's why, kind of tying back to your previous question about, why does the world need to take note, is because this next generation is going to be the generation that's going to be leading the world, and this is what they are focused on.
Okay. Mr. Henry, I want to ask you, I think when a lot of people think about NFTs, many of them are thinking about GIFs or pieces of digital art. Can you give some examples of these asset-backed tokens that are going to become more and more mainstream and something that people would be able to understand, in a concrete sense?
Absolutely. That's a great question. And I personally have never liked the NFT label because to me, that's a type of technology. We have fungible tokens, right? One of many in a class. We have non-fungible tokens, makes total sense. And the idea of using an NFT to represent assets that are inherently singular in nature, that could be art, it could be, the home that you own or your car title, etc. Again, I think that makes a lot of sense. What I think people need to start drilling into, and actually as individual investors, and I agree, I think with everything that my fellow panelists are saying, but I think as individuals, it's also quite important that we take responsibility for our own investment decisions. And I think it's important to really start by asking 3 fundamental questions, right? As a very base layer, no matter what asset class you're looking into. Question number 1 is, who is this counterparty that you're dealing with? The truth is, whenever you make any investment, digital or otherwise, you are interacting with a platform, with a counterparty. I think it's important that you know who they are, how they're licensed, and even just the legal relationship that you have between you and your counterparty. That's number 1. Number 2, it's very important that when you buy into a asset or a token, you understand, well, what exactly is the nature of this token? Am I buying a token that represents, a share in a company? Am I buying a token that represents ownership in an art piece, for example? What exactly am I getting? I worry that with a lot of NFTs, for example, people sometimes believe that holding a token gives them ownership or legal rights that it may or may not. Right? So the idea of having a token represent ownership in digital art makes total sense. But again, most NFTs don't actually represent that. So I think question number 2 you need to ask yourself is, what is the actual nature of this token? And then, of course, question number 3 is, well, what does this underlying asset link to this token? What exactly is that in the first place? So let's say you're coming to a platform like Fusang and you're buying a token that directly represents equity, great. But hey, what exactly is that company? Is it a good company? Is it a good investment, etc.? And I think it's very important that people ask those 3 layers: counterparty, the legal nature of the asset, and of course the underlying asset itself, no matter what kind of technology we apply. Having fungible tokens, non-fungible tokens, these are all just efficient ways of recording data, allowing us to be able to transfer tokens from person to person. It doesn't necessarily affect the nature of the underlying investment itself. And I think we need to be careful to separate those 2 things out. And I think that the same is true for regulators as well. I think some of the more sophisticated countries, Thailand included, have taken a very cogent view of regulation around digital assets by saying, look, it's new tech. New tech comes all the time. That's very exciting. Let's look through to the underlying nature of what these tokens represent when we need to decide how to regulate them.
Okay, and when it comes to regulation, when you see a lot of money being exchanged between parties, inevitably the issue of tax starts to creep in. Can I get your perspective from any of you about what we should be keeping an eye on when it comes to issues related to tax?
Sure, so I can probably start off. So out of the 3 or 4 countries that we've been dealing with, Thailand has been the most vocal about capturing tax as part of the transaction that customers, the customers or capital gains that customers achieve from their kind of investment. And I think previously, what they were looking at was a pure straight line withholding tax, which in Thailand was 15%. What they soon realized is that actually that sparked a lot of outrage in the public because it does not kind of take into account whether people have actually made a profit or a loss in their investment in crypto assets. So, the Revenue Department has kind of taken a few steps back and really tried to consider what is the best way kind of moving forward in terms of taxing capital gains effectively. So they've kind of taken a 12-month breather to kind of really, rethink their kind of tax system, which I think is a good thing. And we've been quite vocal about it. My co-founder, Dr. Apalapa, has been quite vocal about it. And so they've kind of taken this position now. For Singapore, I think as of recent, the government had came out to say that they're going to start taxing people who are selling NFTs, which is quite interesting, and I think they haven't quite landed on a position yet. As most of you know, Singapore does not have any capital gains tax, so any crypto gains are basically tax-free. And actually, as a result of this, a lot of people from around the world, be it Australia or China or in Europe, are actually coming into Singapore because of this tax regime at this point in time. So it's extremely attractive. And there are other countries as well, like for example, Portugal, which has zero tax, and Dubai as well. But in Indonesia itself, there is a propensity to capture capital gains tax as well, but the government hasn't been as proactive as the other governments around in this region. So they're still taking a backseat view on this. But yeah, that's kind of the lay of the land at the moment.
Correct me if I'm misunderstanding this, but with traditional stocks, etc., usually you can hold the stocks and then they can rise in value or they can fall in value, but you don't usually get hit by a tax until you sell and make a profit, and then on that profit you would get taxed a certain percentage. So I guess the muddying issue with digital currencies is that you're holding these, for example, cryptocurrencies, and they may rise in value. And where is that cutoff that you would then calculate what you're getting, what you would be responsible for paying?
Yeah, so this is the really challenging part, right? Because if you invested in an online brokerage account, you can easily track when you bought and sold an asset. With crypto exchanges, the moment you deposit a digital asset like Bitcoin, the regulator or the exchange wouldn't actually know at what price did you buy it at. And this is the fundamental issue that most, I guess for Thailand and in Indonesia are trying to grapple with. There are kind of effectively two ways of taxing, this, I guess this ecosystem. One is looking at capital gains tax, which is effectively how much money you've made. And the challenge that I've just kind of mentioned about is what they're trying to grapple with. The other is a transactional tax, so VAT or GST, that can be kind of embedded into the actual commission that we charge as an exchange, or could be a one-off transaction that the customer pays. So it just depends on who pays for the tax bill. It can be shared or it could be both.
Mr. Henry, do you have perspective on this as well?
Absolutely. I hope our Zoom doesn't boot us off in just a minute. But in case it does, I'll join back again. To me, tax, as I said, it's very important to look through to the nature of the underlying assets. And I hope actually that regulators around the world take that view as well. I don't think it makes any sense for someone to say, I want to tax NFTs as a type of technology.
Okay, it looks like Mr. Henry will be logging back in. He was in the middle of answering a question about how his opinion about how tax would be related to transactions in the digital space. So I'm going to wait until they log back in, but it's very interesting to hear about how these markets in some ways are similar to the traditional markets in how we're trying to perceive them. But then because it's so new and there's so many new rules that are being made every day around them and the way that we interact with them, it seems that the borders are not as defined, and this creates a kind of uncertainty. And I'd like to get our panelists to maybe address this about when I asked the question of if you're someone new to investing in digital assets, what would you recommend for them as a first step to getting involved in these markets? But I think it's also interesting to hear about where do they see in the not the long term, but more in the foreseeable future, where these markets are evolving into, so that we could perhaps get some insight into how we can learn about more opportunities, where we as investors or as potential business owners that want to raise capital for our own activities, how can we take advantage of this digital space? Now, it's very interesting to hear that when I asked them the question about how are digital assets being viewed in your country or in your territory, for them, territory is no longer limited by national borders, and it seems that everyone is taking a more global view about their business. It's not everything is limited by the passport anymore, and it seems that everything is becoming more fluid. Our panelists are back, and thank you very much for rejoining us. Mr. Henry, you were in the middle of answering about what you felt, in your opinion, implications surrounding tax and digital assets.
Yeah, well, maybe the internet gods thought that we were talking for too long. So I'll keep this short. As I said, I think we should always look through to the underlying asset, whether it's tax, whether it's regulation, that makes the most sense. Unfortunately, this isn't always true in every jurisdiction, and I think especially for what I call crypto-native assets like Bitcoin, where the technology and the asset are so intertwined, sometimes people, quite frankly, get confused and treat the technology and the asset as one inseparable thing. But I think it's always very important to look through to understand the underlying legal nature of assets. And that's why, at least in our focus around security tokens, where you are looking to create something like an equity token and have a token directly represent a share in a company, I think that's much simpler than creating more convoluted structures, let's say where you have some kind of derivative or investment contract. As it is, the kind of technology that we are introducing is novel. I don't think we need to also necessarily touch the underlying legal nature of a lot of securities. We can keep that, and we can just transform from having a whole bunch of paperwork and paper shares, for example, into using digital tokens. And like I said, whether as a firm, as an issuer, as an investor, or even as a regulator, I personally think that's the right approach to take.
Thank you. I have a question regarding what we see as in the foreseeable future, within the next 1 or 2 years, that each of you feel is a trend or a development that you feel that is something that we really need to keep an eye on as potential investors or as business owners who are looking to enter the digital asset space. Something that if you were to meet somebody on the street and they found out where you worked and they asked you, oh, so what do you think is something that I should be looking at? Not necessarily for speculation, but as Mr. Marcus had said, something that is really interesting to learn about or to explore for potentially adding to our lives. Mr. Nichel, can we start with you?
Yeah, I guess I can start. Certainly, what I would talk about is while crypto has gone more mainstream now at the retail segment, what we should watch out for is institutional participation. I think a lot of people have been talking about this for a couple of years now, but a lot of pieces need to have been in place for institutions to actually come into the market. We now see a lot of traditional custody providers, global custodians entering into the digital asset space. We're seeing independent firms set up as value agents and accounting firms and financial advice. So eventually we will see more and more companies asking themselves what should be their crypto strategy. So that's what I look out for, because definitely while it will inform price action, on particularly on scarce assets like Bitcoin, it would also improve the underlying infrastructure to the point that opening up a crypto account probably will feel no different from opening a bank account, and we could really transact using crypto that is living. Tax also, at the earlier question, eventually as this space more and more value creation takes place in the digital asset space, there will be more pressure on legislators and tax authorities around the world to start having to capture some of that value for their respective governments. So those two things, institutionalization and tax.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Nichel. Mr. Marcus?
I think we're hearing a lot of background noise from the studio.
Yeah, that's correct.
Okay. Guys, can we please keep down? Okay, thanks. All right, sorry. Can Mr. Marcus, can you answer the same question about what you feel is in the immediate future something to keep a very close eye on?
I'm really sorry, but there's a lot of background noise happening, so I can't actually quite respond or hear.
Sorry, do we have some background noise?
It seems like it's coming from the studio.
Nope, we don't have anyone in here with us. Everyone's being... Okay.
Sure. Sorry, could you repeat the question again? Sorry.
Yeah, the question was about what you feel in the next year or two is the trend or development that we should be keeping a close eye on, because it would give us an opportunity to learn more about something important that's developing in this space.
Yeah, definitely. So I think there's quite a few things that have already been mentioned, but I think the first thing that's quite interesting to me is actually payments, or mobile payments. And if I kind of look at Southeast Asia, where you have a huge population that's unbanked, so Indonesia, for example, 60% of the entire population is unbanked. Thailand, has a slightly smaller proportion, but still a fairly large one compared to the rest of the Western world. And if we look at, the way, digital assets operate, effectively you can, send value to anyone through a wallet address. And you can do it fairly seamlessly, and in time to come, instantly, and then also at almost no cost, right? And so if we look at the traditional world whereby, banks need to provide infrastructure to a lot of, to the mass population in order for them to be banked, digital assets, or the kind of the whole nature of digital assets, basically cut through and makes everything far more efficient and cost effective. And so I think one of the kind of the short-term trend that I like to see is how can we, start to really include, have financial inclusion in Southeast Asia, not through just the traditional, TradeFi, or kind of the neo banks, but rather how can, crypto exchanges or platforms play a part in financial inclusion. So I think that's definitely the first one. The second one, of course, I think, as I've already mentioned it, which is really interesting, is, we are living in an endemic world. No longer pandemic, it's endemic. And the fact is, there will always be restrictions in place in terms of how we can interact from a physical location. And so I think that there's generally a shift for people to be more isolated or more geographically dispersed, right? More work from homes are going to be the norm now. So I think this interaction from a virtual perspective is really kind of important. And what I talked about is, the metaverse and also gaming. I think, how much time we've spent on our mobile phones, in front of our computers or our TV, I think has increased tremendously over the last 2 years. And so I think that trend there is like, how is that entire ecosystem and world is going to be built out? How do we, do online shopping anymore versus like how we've done it traditionally through a website? So I think that whole space is still very unclear at this point in time, but super, super interesting because there's so many, kind of really cool and innovative things that are coming out. For example, how brands are trying to interact with their own clients without having them to kind of physically be at the shop. So I think those are kind of like the two major trends. And I think the third one, kind of going back to, I guess for a lot of viewers, what are they kind of interested in? I think, we've seen, kind of the first phase of what, of cryptocurrencies and how people can invest in it. Now we've kind of looked at, tokenized assets or asset-backed tokens. And this space has been, like people have been looking at this space for the last 4 or 5 years. I remember back in 2017, people thought that, after cryptocurrency, security tokens was going to be the next wave. And now we are here in 2022 and still hasn't really quite taken off. I think, the reason why it hasn't quite taken off is because of regulation. That is probably the biggest impediment. So when we have kind of the right regulatory framework in place, these sorts of investments can thrive. In Thailand, for example, we start to see that, a natural real estate fund, Siri Hub has actually raised 70 to 80 million US dollars through an ICO portal, right? So ICO portal, but it's actually a security token. So that's actually really interesting because in Thailand and Indonesia, for example, they have no concept of a REIT, whereas in Singapore you have REITs. And this whole idea of fractional ownership of being able to buy part of a real estate asset is quite liberating for a lot of people because typically they won't have the spending power to buy the entire asset itself. So I see this whole democratization of ownership, right, is really coming into fruition, and more things are going to be able to be fractionally owned.
Mr. Henry, I've got a question for you that's a little twist on this. So if you have somebody who is, still in school, teen or tween, and you had to give them some advice about what is it that would be important for them to know as they are growing up into this space where the metaverse is going to be more of a mainstream thing, and what would you say is important for them to really look into when it comes to preparing for this future?
So, technology, especially in the digital asset space, changes unbelievably quickly. And I think that's why I'd maybe quote two people. One, Mark Twain once said that, history never repeats itself, but it often rhymes. And two, Jeff Bezos famously once said that when they were building out Amazon, again, in a fast-moving tech environment, they try and focus on the things that don't change. Because if you focus on those, you can build for the long term. In Amazon's case, for example, people always want, larger product selection, lower prices, faster shipping, etc. So I would say someone in their tweens looking at the digital asset space, I'd encourage them to think in that lens. Again, rather than getting caught up necessarily in technology, which will be ever evolving, trying to drill into the basics and say, well, what is it that people want? I believe that everybody wants an opportunity to take their hard-earned money and invest it into assets that actually give them a productive return. And increasingly, people are going to want to be able to invest into companies where they actually feel like I am part of that company. Like I am not just a stakeholder in a company, but I can be a shareholder too. And those two things are interlinked. And again, I would tell someone, focus on what it is that the technology can deliver against actual customer needs instead of just getting caught up in the tech. And if you can do that and you can continue to iterate and deliver and innovate, I think you'll do just fine. Not just, in terms of making sure you're on the right technology trends, but also within a company. Right? I think all of us here in this virtual panel, we run young startups, young companies. I talk a lot to university students, for example, and I always tell them the same thing, which is if you can be a hardworking problem solver, someone who can help a company figure out how to innovatively deliver value against your customer needs, you will do just fine.
Thank you very much. That's a great answer, Mr. Henry. Mr. Nichel, do you have anything that you'd like to add to that?
Well, I just want to say that I appreciate hearing about those two quotes. Building with an eye towards things that don't change certainly is very good advice. And look, and it's not just very good advice, but it's very relevant advice, because we are what we are seeing now in the crypto markets probably is not going to be, it's not going to be forever, right? Definitely, the space is currently very hot. A lot of investor interest is coming into the space, and one might say that there could be a lot of capital right now flowing into too few ideas, right? So perhaps to somebody starting a career in crypto in this environment, it would be very good to focus on building really valuable skills in a role or in a sector that probably will be here forever. Obviously, all of us here are exchanges, right? So we do have our biases for sure. But having been in the markets throughout my career, I also do know how fast the weather can change, right? So probably focusing on developing real skills in business development, in management, in marketing, and everything might actually be a better use of one's early stage career, rather than maybe thinking of cash grab opportunities and let's issue our own token and that kind of stuff.
Okay. Thank you very much, Mr. Nichel Gaba, from founder and CEO of PDAX Philippines. Thank you, Mr. Henry Chong, CEO of Fusang, Malaysia, Hong Kong, and also thank you to Mr. Marcus Lim, CEO and co-founder of Zipmex Singapore, who unfortunately is not with us right now. We really appreciate your time and your kindness in sharing your experiences and insight into where digital assets are heading, what to keep an eye out for, and what's exciting on the horizon. So thank you very much for your time. We really do appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.